How Did You Go Bankrupt? Two Ways, Gradually, Then Suddenly. That's by Ernest Hemingway in The Sun Also Rises. So the U.S. has increasingly been weaponizing the dollar since it's the world reserve currency. And the most recent example is taking Russia off the SWIFT system. So what's happening is other nations are looking at this and they're thinking they should have their own currency backed by commodities. So central banks are buying gold at record rates. And it started in 2017 when the Bundesbank in Germany started repatriating its gold, which means they're bringing home their gold that's stored outside their country. But it didn't start that way. At first, central banks were selling their gold and investing in treasuries or assets, basically income-producing assets. And the Bundesbank of Germany had been trying to get their gold back for a few years, but out of nowhere, they started to really make a big deal out of it in 2017. So why would they want to repatriate their gold from the New York Fed when there seemed to be a movement away from precious metals and into other forms of investment? And within a few weeks of that, you had all these other banks, the Bank of Turkey, Poland, Austria, Hungary, the Dutch National Bank, the Czech National Bank, and all of these banks, they wanted their gold back, not just from the New York Fed, but also from the Bank of England. Now remember, this was happening in 2017. They bought more gold as a group than they did in the 60 years previously combined. So what's going on? What do they know? Global world currencies have a 100% failure rate. 100% of empires that have ruled the world have come to an end, and yet Americans are the only ones who think that their empire will never come to an end. It will never happen to them. They think the military will somehow save them, as if the military is the answer to everything. Once again, they don't learn from history. All this is happening with gold, and then the Bank of International Settlements, they came out with the declaration of revaluing gold as a high-quality liquid asset, meaning it's as good as cash. And if you look at that and you realize that the acquisition of gold and the repatriation of gold, which was almost 2.5 years prior to this declaration of revaluing gold, you have to wonder, were they clued in on the revaluation of gold? Were they told something is about to happen? Now, you don't know if the U.S. was left out of this conversation or not. It was part of the Basel III, which is basically the international banking supervision. The U.S., they couldn't know about it because Gaddafi's gold and Saddam Hussein's gold isn't accounted for. Ukraine sold $25 billion worth of gold to fund the war, so nobody knows if the U.S. was accumulating gold or getting it in other ways. And then a big piece of the narrative came into play in 2020, the Chinese Belt Road Initiative. It's the largest infrastructure project in human history, and it started to gain traction in 2020. It's connecting Asia and Africa and parts of South America and Europe. All 13 OPEC producing countries are on the Belt Road Initiative. So that's almost 70% of the human population and 40% of global GDP. And guess what? The US dollar is nowhere to be seen. Most of it is settling on the Chinese digital yuan. There's a growing group of countries and an isolation of the US dollar. Then, after the US, they left Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, they basically signed a death warrant for the petrodollar by announcing a joint military cooperation agreement with Russia. So the reason this is important is because of how the dollar became the global currency to begin with. Kissinger went to Saudi Arabia and he struck a deal. The U.S. will protect them, but for that protection, they'll need to denominate oil globally in dollars. This deal had created massive demand for the dollar for the last 50 years. So what happens when Saudi gets rid of this deal? The joint military cooperation between Russia and Saudi is something that the media ignored, but it has huge implications on the grand scheme of things. So you start to see not only global de-dollarization, but also other nations that are growing together, like all the 13 of the OPEC producing countries, on the Belt Road Initiative. In Nigeria, they're selling their gold to China for the Petro Yuan bond, which immediately it's convertible into gold on the Shanghai Gold Exchange. So this is how countries like Iran, they've sidestepped sanctions. They sell their oil to China for a bond that's immediately converted into gold. So let me bring you back to that quote from Ernest Hemingway. How did you go bankrupt? Two ways, gradually, then suddenly. There's a growing group of countries that are formulating around the BRICS to make a move against the dollar. Saudi, they started looking at Russia for protection, but all of this happened before the Ukraine war. Russia isn't really projecting a lot of military strength in this war, so this is more likely than not one of the reasons why Saudi Arabia announced to the world that their nuclear submarines have hypersonic ICBMs, and it's why they want to join the BRICS. Alone, they stand no chance. Together, their militaries are stronger and their GDPs are a lot bigger. They're standing up to a system where the U.S. can print dollars because printing dollars makes the debt that they owe the U.S. become bigger and bigger. A lot of people think none of this actually matters to them until the day it does. When the global reserve currency comes to an end, inflation will skyrocket to levels you've never seen before. And because America is based off finance capitalism, the workforce isn't globally competitive because U.S. labor is too expensive. America is becoming increasingly non-competitive on a global scale. We're coming from a period of time where asset prices were amplified over the last several years, with more money being created in the last 3 years than in the history of the country. Most of that money found its way into assets, leaving the rich richer and the poor poorer. All it would take is for Saudi Arabia to say that they're now considering taking other currencies for oil. And all of the countries that have been forced to hold dollars for the last 50 years, they don't need to. And if they start to dump dollars, you would have a massive inflation that would immediately create a spike in interest rates to compensate for the loss of purchasing power. And this is how we see a great reset as interest rates spike in relation to a crashing dollar.